Howdy, folks. Welcome to our August edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Mighty glad to be your host. Today, we are zooming to the Western Trail. So we'll be headed to Southwest Oklahoma to learn about a beautiful museum in that part of the region. Today, instead of a Western trivia question, I want to begin with a save the date announcement because plans have come together for our 2022 Chisholm Trail Conference, and we are very excited. So please mark your calendars for October 14 and 15 in Oklahoma City. We'll say more about this a bit later and give some more specific information. But mark your calendars for October 14 and 15 in Oklahoma City. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the Chisholm and the Western Trail. We spent a lot of time on the Chisholm Trail. Today, we're headed to the Western Trail. The showcase is brought to you by the International Chisholm Trail Association, of which Dennis Katzenmeyer is president, Michael Grauer is vice president, Nancy Lawrence is secretary, and Mary Lou Rivers is treasurer. Lonnie Stephen is our showcase chair. Since we're headed to the Western Trail today, I'm going to ask Michael Grauer to do the introduction. Michael is vice president, as I mentioned, of the International Chisholm Trail Association. He's also president of the Western Cattle Trail Association. So it's fitting for him to introduce our guests from the Western Trail today. So Michael, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Much obliged, Ron. I'm delighted to be with you all again, as always, and having just returned from Dodge City, Kansas during Dodge City Days, where we had the Western Cattle Trail Association annual conference and had really great turnout and enthusiasm for all the four different presentations related to that. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, and especially the institution, because I had the opportunity and the honor to go out there in April of this year to give a presentation on my book on H.D. Bugbee. And I'm also pleased to say that it was actually the Western Trail Historical Society in 1966 that set out to found the museum we're going to hear about today. And so that's very gratifying to me, particularly because they didn't use the unfortunate adjective in the name of their society. And so I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Jennie Buchanan. And I can tell you that being in the museum field for nearly 40 years, oftentimes I get to go speak at smaller museums. And usually when you go to a museum, there are unrealistic expectations sometimes, and oftentimes they're not met. But I'm here to tell you today, I was frankly blown away by what Jennie and her staff have done there. It's phenomenal, particularly since she's been there since 2011. She made that place first rate and has a professional staff and a professional approach to all the exhibits, particularly in their, I guess it's about 10 years old now, Jennie, the McMahon Gallery. And the exhibits are first rate, just first rate. And they maintain them, which is often a challenge in a museum that's far from the mothership, like Museum of the Western Prairie is, being a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society network. But they really have done really phenomenal work with excellent artifacts, excellent interpretation. And one of the things, and this is a favorite topic of mine, is they actually take the issue of water head on in their exhibits. And that's often avoided in museums because nobody really wants to talk about that and the challenges in the West for water. So I'm going to just stop talking and introduce my esteemed colleague, Jennie Buchanan, and let her take it away. Much obliged.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm excited to be an esteemed colleague of Michael Grauer. Makes me feel like I've kind of earned my wings here. I have to tell you, Ron, that when you went to recording, I lost my ability to share screen. Can you give that back to me? At one point, along the bottom, you know, where you elect to turn on the mic, turn on the video, there was also a share screen. It no longer exists.
So that green share screen icon is gone.
Okay, and it just came back. So I'm all right. So
All right, good.
I'm now going to share my screen. Thanks again, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to share this one.
There it comes.
Okay.
We're seeing a calendar.
All right. So what I want to do is take you to a Zoom on Zoom, take you to a virtual tour of our museum. As Michael mentioned, we're a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society. And so if you go to their website, select museums and sites, select museums, and then go to the Museum of the Western Prairie. And this is an outside view of our museum, taken when we've had more rain than we have recently. And as you scroll down, you'll see we offer both a video or an audio tour as well as a virtual tour. We're going to take a look at the virtual tour. So you can get there by simply clicking this button. Now, everyone's seeing that? I hope so. Ron, can you see it?
We're seeing a dark screen. There it comes. There you go.
Okay, marvelous. Okay. So we're going to take a look at not the whole museum today, but we'll try to focus on Western Trail aspects of the museum. So I'll begin this, and in a moment I'll take the controls, but this will show us once again the outside of the museum. And as Michael said, it was built in 1974. We've had the opportunity, with the support of our local community and the expertise of the Oklahoma Historical Society, to completely renovate the museum from front door to back in the last 7 years. And all of those dollars, and I just have to brag, came from our local community. So it's tremendous community support for this museum. So as you enter the museum, of course, you come through and sign our register there in the gift shop and reception area. This is the McMahon Gallery that Michael mentioned, and this is one of our newest exhibits, and it's a buffalo hide painting that was given to us by one of our favorite local sons, Larry Derryberry. What it does is capture kind of the pre-written history of this area, introduces that, and so it shows the exploration parties of Coronado that came through in the 1540s. A nod to the supposed gold and silver mining that went on in the Quartz Mountains. And I think that was legend and lore. I don't think anyone ever got rich mining gold and silver here. And we do know that there was a Wichita village in this area, the Devil's Canyon area, from about the mid 1750s to the mid 1800s. And so we introduce the story this way and then begin with other exhibits. And as we make our way to the back, I wanted to show you, a cornerstone exhibit of the museum. I'm going to back it up here just a little bit. And this is a photography exhibit. All of the photography was done by a gentleman named George Washington Long, who lived in the Lone Wolf area, which is up above Altus, about 20 miles to the north. And he took these photographs in the early 1800s, really gained the trust of the Kiowas and Comanches that were in the area at the time, became known as the photographer of the Kiowas. And as such, captured a very important period in time. And it was that time, of course, when Native Americans were being pressured by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and others to adopt the ways of Western culture, to adopt an agrarian lifestyle. And he's recorded this in photographs. We have 348 of his photographs. The remainder of those are in the Western History Collection at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. a part of our collection is also the tramp art frames. Now, these were handmade by Mr. Long later in his life and are a perfect complement to the content of his photographs. Now then, let's go to the Western Trail exhibit, which is just right next door to it. Oh, did that make you dizzy? Up this way and over. Here we go. There we go, with the right name on it, Michael. Of course, this one centers around a photograph, a large mural made from a photograph of cowboys around a campfire there at the chuck wagon one evening. And we also have a recording that plays of the sounds of those cowboys might be hearing at that time. As Michael told you, our local Friends group chose the name of the Western Trail Historical Society way back in the 60s, even before the museum was built. And they did that because, of course, a portion of the trail came through after Doan's Crossing is headed north, came through this area. We have a wonderful story that's in a recorded interview with Mrs. Guy P. Horton, who came to this area in the early 1890s as a child with her family. They settled 6 miles east of Altus, and she can recall standing on the top of their half dugout and watching what she called the last cattle trail or the last cattle drives go by. I think those were probably off in the distance. I don't think they came, through the yard. But I think she certainly could have seen the dust. She could have heard the cattle. She talks about hearing them, and she talks about hearing the cowboys. And so she saw that in the distance. Now then, her experience was typical in that a lot of our early day settlers in this corner of Oklahoma were displaced Southern planters who, following the Civil War, had moved to areas in Texas, particularly Wise County. And then as those generations were coming up, the next generations were coming of age and they were seeking land of their own, they came north to Old Greer County for that land. And that was the case with Mrs. Guy P. Horton's family. That interview continues, and she talks about that their half dugout, and she has this marvelous Southern accent that I don't do justice to, but she says was embellished by the presence of a portrait of Queen Victoria and a portrait of Robert E. Lee, as well as a full set of the English poets. And she has quite a wonderful history. Her mother had raised a family of 6 children. All 6 children attained a full college education. Right there at the very beginning of the 1900s in a rather remote area, but she saw to it that happened. So to continue the Western Trail story, facing this exhibit, you won't be surprised that we have a chuck wagon. And this one came to us. It was actually used on a ranch in the Snyder area, which is over to the east of Altus, about 30 miles. Now, children, of course, are fascinated with this. And so we show them the chuck wagon and talk about how it got its name. And I had gone through that long explanation of, that it was perhaps first used by a Texas Panhandle rancher named Charles Goodnight, and that he put it together as a way to feed his cowboys when they were either on the trail or away from the ranch, at least. And I said, and for that reason, some people think it's named Chuck after Charles Goodnight. I said some history records that at that time, chuck was simply a name for a slang word for food. So instead of calling it a food box, he called it a chuck box, and he put it on a wagon, so it became a chuck wagon. And as a former English teacher, I was quite proud of myself because I taught the etymology of a word. I told children the history of a word. And this fifth grader raised his hand and he said, "So, do you think that's where the word upchuck comes from?" Yes, I think it was, and tried quickly to go on to the next exhibit. You'll see atop this, I think I can zoom in just a little bit. This is a maquette of a piece that was done by Harold Holden, H. Holden, the Oklahoma artist, and it's called Crossing the Red. This was commissioned by the Rotary Club of Altus as a service project back in the 90s. They sold the maquettes to raise the money to actually do a larger than life size sculpture, and that sits now in front of the courthouse at the intersections of Main and Broadway here in Altus, and it's a beautiful piece by H. Now, I mentioned homesteaders, so we'll take a look at this homesteading case. And that's really where I want to transition, because as soon as almost as soon as the Western Trail got started, just within years, homesteading came about in a big way. And the mission of the museum is actually to tell the story of the settlement of this corner of Southwest Oklahoma. So the collection, and therefore the exhibits, focus on the years of about 1880 to 1920 or so. And we really tell that story of homesteading. It's introduced in this case. And I love every piece in this case, but I'll tell just a quick story about the pitcher and bowl that sit there on the wash stand. Because they're a gorgeous antique piece that belonged or came from the home of the daughter of an early day family that came to the Blair area. And they were an anniversary gift from her husband. And they look a little grand for that case. But I have another story from a recorded interview. And this one was done with a woman who homesteaded on her own near Hobart, Oklahoma. She was a school teacher as well. And she was talking about her home. And she said, you know, in my half-dugout, I have my china, my embroidered linens, and my sterling silver. Sometimes sod roofs cover pearls. And I've just always been in love with that phrase of a sod roof covers pearls. So I felt like this pitcher and bowl, as gorgeous as they are, were examples of that. Now then, if I can get back in control of this, I'm going to take you into the next gallery. Okay, I think I'm back in control. I apologize. This is not quite that hard to do. I just told Ron, I think I have trouble talking and driving at the same time, but here we go. Now then, what I'm going to do is take us into the neighboring gallery. Michael, you'll recognize this one as the one where you did your presentation for us. And we do have a good programming space in there. We're going to talk about this particular map that makes up one of our exhibits. I'm going to try to get you kind of square onto it. This really tells the settlement story, and it's a unique settlement story for this little corner of Oklahoma. I think you might be able to see that this is highlighted in pink. So this is the area that we're talking about. It's this area that's represented on the enlargement of the map. And you'll see that it's called unassigned land. And this is a Rand McNally map from 1892. Other maps call this disputed territory. And the reason this came about was the 1816 treaty with Spain for the purchase of this area said that the 100th meridian, which forms the west border of Oklahoma, and the main stream of Red River were to be the boundaries of that purchase. Well, the state of Texas claimed that the North Fork was that main channel of the Red River. So this was the boundary claimed by the state of Texas. The United States, however, claimed that the main channel of Red River was the Prairie Dog Town, which is on this map, the boundary claimed by the United States. So this, and here's Altus, which was known as Fraser at that time. So this was actually a part of the state of Texas until, and Texas wanted it. It's 1,500,000 acres. They incorporated, they began homesteading, they established Mangum as their county seat. But the United States fought this all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, after gathering testimony for 4 years, and it was about, I think there's 1,400 pages of testimony. And you can imagine how difficult it was to gather information at that time about how do you prove what's the principal channel of a river. And it depends on what time of year you see it, what place you see it. It was pretty complicated stuff. And of course, photography, we were without drones at the time. So it was pretty primitive. But they gathered that testimony, reviewed it, and after 4 years made their assessment that indeed this Prairie Dog Town Fork is the main channel of Red River. They took this 1,500,000 acres from Texas and declared it Oklahoma territory, opened it for homesteading, and then in 1907, we became a part of the state of Oklahoma on our statehood day, November 16th, 1907. That, as I said, gives us a rather unique history in that we are the only portion of Oklahoma that was settled strictly by homesteading, strictly by an individual saying, coming and saying, this is the 160 acres I want, and going and registering that at the courthouse and proving it up and making it home. There were no lotteries, no land runs, no allotments. At the time, much of Indian territory was being carved up into allotments for the various tribes. This was still a part of the state of Texas. So we do not have any Indian land or reservations in this 1,500,000 acres that was once known as Old Greer County, Texas. And for that reason, we also have no casinos, because in Oklahoma, those can only be built on Indian land. So we'll continue to see what happens when you offer free land. We go to this next exhibit. This was a map that's from 1904, and you can see a major difference in the appearance of it. See all the little towns that have grown up? So once you offer free land, people come. And they established post offices, and there were over 100 post offices in what was once Old Greer County by statehood in 1907. And Greer County was divided at that time into Jackson County, which is down here where Altus is, Harmon County, Greer County, and a portion, the southern portion of Beckham County. So that's kind of the geography part of our settlement history. Now to go on with just a look at the museum, The Altus Air Force Base is one of the two major economic drivers in our town. We have a launch console from an Atlas missile installation. We had 12 of those during the Cold War of the 60s. We also have scale models of all the planes that have flown off the runways since Altus Army Airfield was established in 1943. Now, obviously, those are outside those parameters of settlement that I talked about earlier, but we could hardly be in Altus and not tell that story. Then we move along to an agricultural story. This is a model of a cotton gin, and King Cotton is a reality in Jackson County. Due to irrigation, we've raised more cotton in Jackson County than the other 76 counties of Oklahoma combined. So it truly is our major economic driver. As we go past these cases, these are the ones where Michael talks about, we do talk about water and how vital it was continues to be to our area, and also how it shaped the settlement of this area. And I'd love to tell that story, but I'm going to do what I was asked to do, Ron. You'll be relieved. I'm going to center on the Western Trail. So let's look at one last exhibit while we're inside the museum. And this one's called When Cattle Roamed the Open Prairie. And you'll see we're back in Old Greer County, Texas, but this is about the Crosses Ranch, which was way down here in the corner. And it actually started because of the Western Trail. A young man named L.Z. Edelman, and that's Eddleman, brought a herd of cattle from the Pilot Point area, Denton, Fort Worth, Dallas area, this direction in 1884, and crossed at Dones, came on up and delivered those cattle to Dodge City. He came back the next year with a second herd and stayed. He loved the grass. He loved the open range, of course, and he established what he called the Crosses Ranch. And that's because their brand was two S's crossed in the center, and that gave him the name of the ranch itself. In 1891, he built this home out on the prairie. It's a story and a half, built of limestone gathered in the area. And it's on the National Register of Historic Places. And when the person writing the nomination for that called it the Sentinel on the Prairie, and it very much was. It was the largest structure at the time. It had the first piano, the first set of encyclopedias. So it was quite a house. This is a homestead from house, the homestead certificate. This was one of the upper windows because in the early 2000s, we moved this house to the museum grounds, both as a way to preserve it. But I love that we called it preservation with a small p, because we do recognize that we moved it. With a large P, it would have remained in its location, but it was 28 miles outside of Altus. It was falling down and it needed help. So we moved it here to the museum grounds. Now then, if I am tricky enough, we are going to go outside and take a look at it. Let's try this. Okay, I didn't want to speak too soon, Ron, because when I showed you yesterday, remember, I couldn't get the doors to open, but I practiced overnight. So the tour does take us outside. You saw a glimpse of the Crosses Ranch House, but what we're focused on now is a little half dugout that is also here on the museum grounds. This one was moved from the Victory area, which is west of Altus. It follows the same footprint as the first, the original. You can see this little doorway.
I'm still seeing the gallery.
You didn't get to go outside?
Nobody let me outside. I want to go to recess.
Says I am screen sharing. Is anybody else seeing the dugout?
Oh,
No. Well, I am.
yeah. For some reason, it didn't follow when you went to that screen.
Okay, how about now?
Not yet.
Okay, it said this says I could do
There
a
we
new
go. There we go. I see it outside.
okay. You have to ask for a new share. Didn't know that. So here's the half dugout. I was talking about the doorway. It is short. You have to bend over to go in. Our folks were smaller then. The Criswells raised a family of three children in this half dugout. Most of our early day settlers started this way because we had no railroads, so we had no easy access to lumber. So they simply dug a hole into the side of the hill or straight down if they didn't have a hill and put a roof on it. The Criswell's son, and then, of course, after the first crop or two, most of them built a home. Not so with the Criswells. They continued to live in this. And when their son married, George just built a dugout next door. But most of them, as I say, started this way and then moved to another home. Now, if we turn around, we'll see the Crosses Ranch House. And she is a sentinel. She's beautiful. I've often joked that I would have loved to have this down on our ranch, which is down on the Texas line. But the community really didn't want to move it for me, but they agreed to move it here to the museum grounds. And at the time we moved this, it was the oldest existing structure in Southwest Oklahoma. It was built in 1891. And I told that story to a group of Air Force pilots, international pilots who were here at the base for training. And we had done pretty good with English all the way through, but I'm standing in front of that front door and he said, oldest existing structure built in 1891. And the four guys right in front of me were from France. I thought, well, I probably didn't impress them much, you know. So since I've gotten a new spin for that story, because I think it's important to recognize that Oklahoma is the 46th state in the nation. We became a state in 1907, not so long ago. And this little corner, this southwest corner of Oklahoma was the last corner of that very young state to have been settled. So that's really about as far back as our settlement history goes, is 1891. We did locate this to the museum grounds. We took it apart stone by stone, starting here at the chimney. Took each piece off, cleaned it, put a piece of tape around it, put a number on it, numbered every single stone, put them on pallets, brought them to town, and then put it back up in the reverse order. So she stands here much like she did out on the prairie. And because it is in even courses, it made it possible to move it and reconstruct it that way. And its real value is that the first child that was born in this house was named Nellie Bly Edelman. And kind of as her namesake, you may remember Nellie Bly as a reporter for one of the Chicago papers, the Chicago Tribune, who made the trip around the world just before the turn of the century. Nellie Bly Edelman also became a writer, and we have letters, journal entries, poems, newspaper articles, various other accounts that she wrote. So we really have a lot of good stories to tell about this house. To continue our tour of the courtyard, you see an old school bell. The children love ringing that. And then you'll see a windmill here. And I tell the story that two inventions are said to have settled the West. Barbed wire gave us control of the land, and windmills made the land habitable. And I find that while folks have seen windmills, they've seen them from the road. They've never really seen one of them work. And this is a working windmill positioned over a well. And so when the wind's blowing, it'll turn, it pumps water into the tank. We have goldfish in the tank because my grandpa always had goldfish in his horse tank. And children consider it quite magic when it pumps water from underground and it begins to pour out the spout and into the tank. And one child even said that, he says, "Wow, that's magic." I thought, I'm sure that felt that way to our early day settlers as well. Because those who chose homesteads that did not have live water, didn't have creeks or stream or the river, needed a way to bring water to the surface, both for their family as well as their livestock, and windmills gave them that opportunity. Now then, one last, as you look at this side of the museum, you can kind of see that the half dugout I showed you earlier serves as a bit of an inspiration to the architect, in that our museum is built to resemble a half dugout. And that's apparent. And a good bit of it is underground, which makes it a pretty good place to be in case of a storm as well. Now that, Ron, I didn't keep up with time, but I think I'm about there. And so I wanted to end by telling you that the museum is open Tuesday through Saturdays from 10 to 5. We welcome guests. We love to tell our stories. And I'm always available to do a director's tour for anyone that wants it. The virtual tour that I just showed you is available on our webpage on the Oklahoma Historical Society site. Now, Ron, did I do my job?
You did outstanding. Folks, a round of applause, virtual and otherwise, for
Thank you.
For Jennie. Fantastic. It's very, very impressive. I think you told us the other day, and Michael and you both alluded to this, that it started in the 70s, but these remodels have been done to update and unify and modernize the exhibits, and it looks fantastic today.
Thank you. Thank you. We just found ourselves in a wonderful spot, being able to kind of do that facelift all at the same time. Now it took a period of years, as you can imagine, but there was a plan at the beginning and we were able to see it through. And the programming space I showed you, that's where Michael did his presentation for us. It allows us to do programming for groups as large as 120, 150. I've had 204. And thank goodness my brother's the fire chief and we didn't get closed down, but I wouldn't recommend that, but it happened that night. But people here look to the museum as a cultural center. They love to come here for programs. We do a lot of historical programs like the one Michael did for us. We also do, like we're entering our 8th season of Live at the Museum chamber music events here in Altus. We do 5 recitals a year. We do tours for 3rd graders. I mentioned that earlier. So it's a very active museum. We did our last full year of programming. We did 76 scheduled events here at the museum. And we do that one full-time employee, one half-time employee, and a host of marvelous volunteers and board members, and a very, very supportive community.
That is wonderful. And I'm impressed that you could do that virtual tour. Some ingenious, I don't know, engineer or somebody figured out a way to do that video and enable the viewer to see the museum virtually. And you managed to get through the whole thing. Proud of you.
Well, and for someone that's doing it on their own, you saw as I went through little blue dots, white dots rimmed in blue. each one of those could be clicked on, and it gives kind of the story I just told you.
Wow.
Not verbally, but you have to read it. So that
Wow.
information is available. They call them hotspots as you go through. So you can go back and learn more about the settlement of the area and our prehistory of the area. But we've got something on the Wichita Indians there. You can go back and see more about George Washington Long or any of that.
Interesting.
There was a group, Ron, if you have a moment, I wanted to mention back when I was talking about the Western Trail Historical Society chose their name because the trail came close to us. They were also the group that saw what had been happening when the Chisholm Trail was marked all the way across the state, and got in touch with the folks out of Duncan. And for the life of me, I cannot remember that gentleman's name.
Chris Jeffries,
can
perhaps,
picture it.
or might have been Chris.
No.
Mr. Clemming, was it Mr. Clemming?
Plenty, yes,
Well,
yes.
I mean,
He actually made a mold for us to use to make our own signs. And 4 members of the Western Trail Historical Society, led by Udell Barton, our president, Dennis Vernon, 2 members, Joe Harkins and Maurice King, began to mark the Western Trail on town sight lines, so every 6 miles across Oklahoma. And then they went to Texas and recruited a group there, and it ended up the Rotary Clubs of Texas took that on and began marking the trail in Texas. And then, they began to work with Kansas and eventually got that trail pretty well marked. And I mentioned to you earlier the book, Finding the Western Trail by Sue Mahoney is the book that tells that story. And I've loaned my copy out. I was going to have it here today to show you, but I did find it on Amazon this morning, if that's a book you don't have in your libraries.
Jenny, there's a couple of questions in the chat. You shared the really interesting story about how this unassigned land was disputed. Lonnie asks, were the settlers who came in and homesteaded when it was considered to be Texas, were they allowed to keep their properties after the land became part of Oklahoma, or how did that transition happen?
That's kind of a yes and no answer. There were actually a couple of presidential orders that came out in that time to Fort Sill that sent the soldiers out and said, get those settlers off because this is disputed. We don't know how it's going to work out. No doubt some heeded that warning. Others went ahead and settled. When they did open it for United States homesteading, Texas had allowed a full section to be homesteaded. So there was a Mr. Perryman. His photograph was in the back of that homesteading case I showed you. And he homesteaded a full section northeast of Duke. The law said he could choose a quarter section of that to keep. So he chose the quarter section. He built the half dugout in his lots on barns. And then he could buy another quarter section for $1 an acre, which is a whole lot of money back then. And so what he did instead was his father homesteaded a quarter section, a brother did, and an uncle did. So he still had his section, but had to go through a lot more hoops to get it. So it made a difference. They were only allowed to keep 1/4 of what they thought they had. It was kind of a tough one, Lonnie.
Very interesting. You mentioned that Fraser was the name on the map, I think, at one point. How did Altus get its name?
Okay. Fraser was a little settlement that was actually 4 miles east of present-day Altus on the banks of the Fraser Creek that we now know as Bitter Creek. And both Bitter Creek and the Salt Fork of Red River are just over to the west of Altus. In 1891, it flooded. And of course, no flood control up above us. These are floods we don't see today because of all the flood control that's happened onto the north. But it actually flooded the little town of Fraser just overnight. The water just rose and destroyed it. About 90% of those structures were half dugouts. And when they flood, it's, a mud puddle. So they moved to higher ground. Now, anyone who's been to Altus, Michael may find this strange, but because it seems very flat, but we're actually higher. And this is higher ground than 4 miles west, and so they called it Altus to go with altitude, and that's the way Altus got its name in 1891. And by the way, it was that same flood that resulted in the Cross S being built, because prior to that time they had lived in a picket house on the banks of Foggy Creek, which is just on down south from this flood I was talking about. Well, the same flood occurred there. And Mrs. Edelman, a young mother, said she woke that morning and the water was at the edge of her mattress. She took her 18-month-old baby and went home to mother in Pilot Point, Texas. And I truly think that he built that house to woo her back across Red River. And it worked. She came and they had 4 children in the house.
Wow, those pioneers were amazing. They were
Way tough, way tough.
Jennie, I have a couple of questions for you.
Yes.
Do you have an annual Western Trail celebration in Altus?
We do not. We have our annual meeting as the Historical Society, and we typically, do something related to the Western Trail or the settlement of the West during that, but we don't call it a particular celebration. No.
I am a cowboy and Western singer and yodeler,
Yes.
and I wonder if you at times have performing cowboy and Western singers perform at your museum.
We do. As a matter of fact, one of our annual meetings, we took clips from old Western movies and played those on the screen. And then Jim Garland, who is a yodeler, guitar player, fiddle player, came and sang those movie songs live for us. We did that in the theater downtown. And then a couple of years ago, we had a country and Western band come in. I think there was a fiddle, guitar, bass, and a vocalist. We set them up outside there by the Cross S up on the berm and set the chairs down below. And while they played, people on that wonderful walkway in the courtyard did a figure 8 2-stepping. So we do lots of fun things like that, Tom.
Do you what was I going to ask? Oh well. So if I were to come through Altus in May, let's say May of next year, would you be open for a performance?
It's possible. We do our programming schedule in October. I finalize it and present it to the board. So we have to get on the schedule. May and June are extremely busy months here. So we have to schedule them early. We have our Altus High School reunion weekend, the 4th weekend in June of each year. The museum does special customized programs for those senior classes. So if your class is celebrating its 50th anniversary, we'll go through the newspaper for your senior year at Altus High, pull out all of the photographs, all of the articles, weave it together in a narrative, divide that up into individual scripts, pass it out to the classmates, and they read it all to each other. An amazing amount of work, but an amazingly good museum work, because what's better than telling people the story of their hometown?
When is your annual meeting?
4 and 5 a year, and they're scheduled through 2027.
When is your annual meeting?
April.
That's a remarkable community service. I know we're running out of time, but one thing we haven't mentioned is the cattle drive at the Air Force Base. And this is a remarkable event. It precedes the Great Plains Stampede Rodeo in Altus. And it's the only Air Force base in the world where they stage a longhorn cattle drive through the base. That's not a public event, I understand. So it's not like the public can go and watch that. It's a promotion basically on the Air Force base. But that was when I learned about that. It's a very unique happening and certainly a great way to promote the Western heritage there in the region.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and they do bring in some of the gentler horses in the community and saddle them up, and the commanders all ride. And I participated in a couple of times. I've been invited to go out, and we've saddled up and ridden with them. And in essence, you kind of trail the cows through. The longhorns are very well behaved because they're brought out to do specifically that and to perform at rodeos and in parades. So you really just kind of ride behind them. But honestly, they think they're cowboys, so it works out. I would bring them down to the ranch to help.
Folks, another big round of applause for Jennie and the museum.
Well, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our chapter of the history of the Western Trail with your group. And I just absolutely salute you as champions of history. Thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you. We
Thank
look
you,
forward
Jennie.
to coming to the museum. We sure do. That's exciting. And Congressman Cole, who's in your region, represents your region, I think, is a co-sponsor of the legislation that would designate the Chisholm and Western Trails. So we greatly appreciate him.
Lucas is actually in our area.
Okay, so Congressman Lucas is also a co-sponsor. So those two have been great champions, and we appreciate them. Thanks. Next month, we're zooming to a special event in Kansas. We'll ask Lonnie, our showcase chair, to say a word about that.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Well, next month, and I believe it's September the 23rd at Cowtown Museum, they have their Wild West Days, and there's already a lot of plans, and it's, I believe Mary Lou probably knows more about it, but they actually have one of the largest gathering of Old West historical reenactors in the region that'll come in that day and do presentations. You know, the Can-Can girls gunfights, gambling, and it's a fundraiser for historic Cowtown. And so we're going to get to hear about that celebration. Actually, let's see, it'll be a week or two ahead of that celebration, our next event. So
yeah, our next showcase will be Friday, September 9. Will be a chance to highlight the Wild West Days, September 23, 24, 25 at Old Cowtown in Wichita. And Nikki Wichita Red, who's coordinating that, is actually on with us today. I need to say a word about our upcoming Chisholm Trail Conference, which will follow in October. And then we need to wrap up. As I mentioned, the dates for the Chisholm Trail Conference are October 14 and 15. Much more detail to come. This will take place in Oklahoma City. But the tentative program calls for an optional tour on the morning of Friday the 14th at the new First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City. And then the bulk of our program will be starting midday with a program, the conference, the tour, and a social at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. So that'll be a lot of fun. Then on Saturday, we invite everyone to stay over for the annual Chisholm Trail Festival in Yukon. Yukon is a community just on the west side of Oklahoma City. We're told that festival attracts thousands of visitors for their Chisholm Trail Festival. So watch for more info and mark your calendars for October 14 and 15. And then join us in September for our Cattle Trails Showcase. To close our program today, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.
Happy trails.
thank you, everyone.